What are some of the most common areas where you see people go wrong when it comes to finger training?
I think that the thing that people struggle with the most is consistency and just continuing, keeping at something for a long enough time to make real gains from it. As you say, everyone's looking for the 6-week program that's going to completely change their climbing. And I think the issue with that is it's only 6 weeks long. I think people, if you want to be fingerboarding, I think you need to be doing it consistently for a very long time, 6 months to a year, really, doing it. Not all the time, but fairly consistently. Because your tendons and your connective tissue adapt very slowly and they need regular loading in order to adapt, in order to encourage them to get stronger. So I think consistency and really sticking with something, even if it's just a few dead hangs, really sticking with it and doing it regularly is the most important thing people can do, I think. And I think it amazes people how little can be beneficial. So if you warm up and do, say, 3 maximum hangs, that's really beneficial. If you do that a couple of times a week for 6 months, that's so beneficial to your climbing. And it's basically quite easy to do, isn't it? It doesn't really take that much time. So I think consistency is the real key that people miss out on. And I think a lot of that is because they're expecting or hoping for a kind of shortcut to get them, you know, Daniel Wood's crimp strength in 2 weeks. But, you know, and as I said, if that was possible, everyone would have Daniel Wood's crimp strength. So, you know, it doesn't work.
It doesn't. Yeah, totally. I know. I think it's always interesting when someone's a good climber and they've been climbing for a long time and they don't train. There's so often this attitude like, I'm going to start training and I'm going to do it for 6 weeks. I'm going to do this block and it's going to be miraculous, you know?
Yeah.
How do you combine these things? Like when you think about training over the course of a year to get your finger stronger, if that's someone's priority, you know, if finger strength is their weakest link, but they also have access to outdoor climbing a lot of the year, or they also want to climb in the gym, is it possible to combine these things? How do you think about combining those things, and what would you recommend for people that are willing to, okay, I'm going to start down this path and I want to stick with it over the long term?
I think one thing that you can do that is, I find really useful, is if you're going climbing outside, is to work out a really good handboard warm-up routine that you can do before climbing. And you can work into that a set of 2 or 3 maximum hangs before you climb, which is great because you know your fingers are warm and you can pull as hard as you want. And also, at the end of the day, you know you've done some maximum hangs on your fingers. So a lot of the time when you go bouldering or route climbing or whatever, you're never pulling 100% on your fingers because there's so much going on.
Right.
So if you do that, you can get really warmed up, not too tired because it's only a few hangs. And at the end of the day, you know you've done your maximum strength training and you've climbed. I think that can be a really good way of doing it. But I appreciate people, they don't want to feel tired when they're climbing. But when you get used to it, 3 absolute maximum efforts on the fingerboard doesn't really tire you out for climbing for the rest of the day.
Yeah. Can we zoom into that a little bit, and can you describe what that might look like? I guess the first question is, do you do a fingerboard warm-up and then do your hangs completely separately from your climbing session? Like, do you do that first and then go do a climbing warm-up on the actual rock later?
Yeah, so I think I like knowing I've done it and I fit it in however it's easiest to do it. So usually that'll be just doing it at home, or maybe you could do that in the van and then go out to the crag.
Yeah.
But I understand a lot of people really don't like warming up on the fingerboard and they much prefer warming up climbing. But for me, I think it's often so much of it, I almost prefer warming up the fingerboard because I really have a good feeling of how my body kind of is after doing that. Because some days you can have terrible days sometimes where you warm up and you just feel awful, can't you? And I know instantly, and then often I just won't bother going out climbing because it doesn't feel worth it. Or you can feel amazing when you warm up and then you think, right, I'm getting on something hard today. It's going to be a good day.
Yeah.
So I like to keep them, I like to do the warm up very definitely first and then head out to the crag, but there's no reason why you can't do your kind of pre-fingerboarding warm up on the rocks. But for me, like you say, the skin issue is a big thing for me as well. So I want to do everything I can to preserve skin. So I don't tend to do loads of warming up on problems outdoors just because skin always limits me.
one of the really interesting sections of your book was about active versus passive finger training. Can you just describe the differences there?
It's always seemed to me like when you're climbing, you have kind of two modes of hanging on. You have a really relaxed, almost kind of drape your hand holds, very open-handed style, or you can have a more active style, which is where you're really grabbing on hard, full crimps, inches, and your hands really working. And I think they're very distinctly different, and I think they need to be trained very differently as well, or separately, because they're not the same grip type. You know, hanging open-handed on a 2-finger pocket is totally different to really squeezing a thin pinch. Because all the structures in your hand are doing completely different things. So I've always thought that was quite an important distinction, because a lot of people, they have their default and they'll just tend to exist within their kind of default area. So a lot of people are just more open-handed climbers, and they'll grab everything open-handed as far as possible. And then when it comes to a really small crimp or a pinch, they might struggle. But then the other way around, you get people that crimp everything. When it comes to a pocket, they just can't open hand. So I think you need to be aware of what you default towards, and then think about training the other area to sort of keep on top of it. So for me, I'm a way more passive climber. I kind of rely on friction a lot more, and squeezing things with my body and open-handed positions. I've always struggled more on really closed up grips, and when my hands are really working to hold on. So that's why the majority of my training for the last 5 or 6 years has been really kind of active finger strength. I've noticed such a difference from that. So then leading on to what I do on the fingerboard as my regular sessions, I do all really active full crimp training, because that's the finger strength style that I feel the worst at when I'm climbing. So I'd basically gear most of my training towards it, because I feel like if I'm just climbing in my normal state on a problem, I will be quite sort of passively hanging on. So I don't get that kind of active training out of a lot of my regular climbing. So when I'm really training for it, I concentrate on that active side that I tend not to sort of lean towards naturally when I climb.
So as far as warming up for a session on the boulders, if you're going to go out and try a project, what might that look like? Do you have one thing that you like to do every time the same way, or do you have variety? And I'd love to hear why, like how you think about that.
Yeah, I'll have a few. I mean, if I'm warming up for a project, then the hangs I'm doing will be tailored towards what I'm going to be climbing on.
Okay.
So if I'm going out to try a sort of slopey prow, then I'll do way more kind of open-handed warming up. Because if I'm not going to engage a full crimp at all on the problem, then there's just no need. So if I'm warming up for something, I'll definitely gear it heavily towards that. But if it's just a more general warm-up or a more general training session, I'll always try to train the things I struggle with the most. So I'll always default towards active grip that I find a lot harder in my sort of general training. And that goes for fingerboarding and for climbing on a board as well. My sort of average session will be geared towards the thing I struggle at the most.